Hello, everybody. I'm here to talk to you about Chapter 11, School Social Work. So let's get rolling. Okay, so school social work is about providing services within schools specifically. So school social workers don't typically go into the community, they typically work within the school itself. And I put a star by credentialed here because I feel like it's important to understand that to be a school social worker, there is a separate credential that you need to obtain. This is more or less a master's level job, and you need to get the same type of credential that teachers get. It's the same process, but obviously it's a different kind of credential. So just be aware of that. So there are a number of things that school social workers do. I'm not going to, read every word on the slides or anything. I made bold a lot of the keywords so that you, when you're reviewing the slides, you will kind of understand what the highlights are. But I do want you to read through them. I'm just not going to read them to you. So school social workers, their role is really around assessing and meeting the needs of students who are in special education. So there are definitely parts of their positions that are around children who are not in special education. There's a lot of counseling that they do. There's a lot of kind of general services that they provide, maybe to low income students or to act as, mediators or advocates for students, or to consult with teachers about things that are going on in the classroom, whatever. But a lot of what they do is around students with disabilities. Okay, so like I briefly mentioned on the last slide, a lot of also what they do is working with students who are maybe more vulnerable. So students who are living in poverty or are homeless. So, we just spent a bunch of time on the According to Need podcast, and we met a social worker. Well, I don't know if she was a social worker, but a social worker type person who did that role in Oakland that played a very large part in Talisha's story. So that's a lot of what social workers do, is that sort of thing, is kind of leverage community resources to try and figure out how to help family issues that are affecting the student. So it's important to remember that everything that a school social worker does is around the impact on the student, and how is what they're doing something that supports the student. Okay. So the knowledge and skills that are specific to school social workers, are not necessarily that specific, right? So these are folks who are doing a lot of case management kind of work. They're looking for resources to provide support to students and families, and kind of putting them together if they can, and being able to do that kind of mediation bridging role, and those are two functions that are very common to most social worker positions, right? So it's not all that different. It's just sort of the context. And then what actually is pretty different is these next three things. So the preventative and healing intervention programs, the programs that that social workers are involved in the school setting are specific to students, right? And specific to the school environment. And then that's the same thing with the consultation and in-service programs for teachers and school administrators. You know, a lot of what social workers do in other roles is talk to other social workers, is talk to other people who work in social services. But in this context, in the school context, they don't, right? They're talking to teachers who might have a surprisingly small amount of education and experience working with more complex populations, right? So it's kind of a different audience for that kind of consultation. Um, and I, around training and support, it's kind of the same thing, right? So, to talk briefly about students with disabilities, it's very important when you're talking about social work in schools to talk about how the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act works. And basically, it's around inclusion and making sure that every child who has a disability is able to receive the services that they need and the education that they need um, in as inclusive an environment as possible. So what that means in practice is that they are being educated in their own neighborhood school whenever possible, and that they are not sequestered away from the other students who are not enrolled under IDEA, right? Like hopefully as many students as can be included in mainstream classes are being included. And by and large, that is the case. You know, that's the whole idea behind IEPs and 504 plans, and just to try and figure out how to make it possible for kids who have maybe some different needs to function effectively in classrooms with other peers who don't have those needs. Mainstreaming is making sure that those students again are with their own peers, and it's not always possible, right? Because there are special education classes for those kids who cannot be in mainstream classes. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about these too specifically. They are being discussed in your book, so you can take a look at those. But there are a number of laws and programs in place that support poor, homeless, and marginalized children. So there has been a big shift in recent decades around diversity and multicultural education in general. And, you know, we've talked before about how the makeup of the country has changed quite a bit in the last, 50 years or so, and how that has shifted the mainstream culture. And that has not been lost on the educational system. So unfortunately, in a lot of ways, the public education system is pretty far behind, right? So it's still being kind of ruled by, dominant culture, middle class, often white kind of values and expectations, and that doesn't really work that well anymore in a much more multicultural environment that we're living in now. So it is really critical that schools are moving to a model where students are learning to think about not only kind of the world that they're in, but their place in it, right? And to kind of be aware of how you move through the world and how you impact the world and how it impacts you in a cultural sense. So schools are kind of moving slowly towards that. Some are doing better than others, right? But it's definitely part of the task here. And another part of this is about bilingual education. So In 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed, and basically it introduced the idea of bilingual education. So it made it possible for students who didn't speak English at all to attend school in a language that they understood. It's kind of been chipped away at in recent decades, but it it it's a valuable service, and especially if you're going to be working in school social work in California, this is something you are definitely going to run into. There are other populations of students that have historically been marginalized that are now more of a focus as time goes on of school social workers. And at the moment, there's a big push around hearing impaired students and also around LGBTQ students. Okay, so basically, when you get down to brass tacks, when you really boil it down, the standards around school social workers is that it's their job to identify the needs of the students and then to find the resource or to help them find the resource to address whatever that need happens to be. So the issue around school funding issues is really around helping to address needs, right? Because if there's no money, there's no way to address the needs of the students. So anyway, and likewise, if your understanding of developmental disabilities is outdated, you're going to have a very hard time supporting those students. Okay, so the focus of the school social worker, there's a few of these. So violence prevention. So depending on where you work, this may or may not be a big part of your job, but in the Bay Area in general, in San Francisco specifically, there are a lot of gangs. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot to be done in violence prevention, and it's a big part of the school social worker role here. But there are plenty of places where you can work where it really is not a huge part. That it's more or less limited to sexual violence, and that's definitely important. But there are certainly places where this is the dominant task. So in every school social work role, unless you're doing the littlest of the little kids, there's always going to be an aspect of pregnancy and disease prevention in your job. Similarly, around tobacco and other drugs, this is always kind of a perennial issue. And it's not about whether marijuana is legal or anything like that. It's about the fact that these are children, and regardless of what the dominant culture is doing around them, children should not be using. Period. That's all there is to it. So there's a lot of work to do in that area. And also, this is a little bit like violence prevention. Dropout prevention is more or less important depending on your context. Obviously, if you work in elementary school, that's not really going to be an issue. But if you work at one of the more impacted high schools in San Francisco, then this is going to be a much bigger part of your job. So that was a short one, but this is definitely a career that that might appeal to you. There's always going to be jobs in school social work. They're all hard. I'm not gonna lie, it's not an easy thing to do. Also, I want to point out that if you are not interested in going forward and getting a credential, it's not that you can't work in school social work. It's that in order to do that, you would have to work in a private school where credentials are not required. So that's always an option to you if you decide to go that way. It's a little harder to get hired without a credential, private or public, but it's not impossible to work in a private school without a credential. So if you have any questions, you know what to do. Click on that link, come on over to office hours. You guys have a lot of work to do this week in other realms. So get on over to those videos and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.